This is our third edition, or third part, of talking about various moon hoax theories and throwing out some counter ideas to what people who believe the moon landing was a hoax are stating, and hopefully this will give you some ideas to work off of. No, not all of these are absolute slam dunks, but I think at least call into question some of the things that are being brought forward. Um, One complaint is brought up that the lunar module made no blast craters or any sign of dust scattering. Well, no crater should be expected. The lunar module was about 10,000, excuse me, the 10,000 pound thrust was throttled down very far during the final landing of the lunar module and was no longer quickly decelerating. So the descent engine only had to support the lander's own weight, which was lessened by the moon's gravity and by the near exhaustion of the descent propellants. At landing, the engine thrust divided by the nozzle exit area was about 1.45 psi, which is close to non existent. Another argument commonly brought up is that the lunar module weighed 17 tons and made no mark on the moon dust, yet footprints can be seen beside them. On the surface of the Earth, Apollo 11's fueled and crewed lander module, Eagle, would have weighed approximately 15,000 kilograms. On the surface of the moon, however, after expending all the fuel and oxidizer on its descent from lunar orbit, the lander weighed about 1,200 kilograms. The astronauts were much lighter than the lander, but their boots were much smaller than the lander's, approximately 3-foot diameter foot pads. Pressure or force per unit per area rather than mass determines the amount of regolith compression. In some photos, the foot pads did press into the regolith, especially when they moved sideways at touchdown. You can see this on Apollo 11's foot pads. So essentially, it's a matter of dispersion of pressure. Photos with issues with crosshairs. Sometimes they seem to be behind objects. Oftentimes they're off center. But what's really going on typically is the crosshairs, when the object gets too bright, the crosshairs tend to get washed out. If you resample the photographs to bring the light value down, the crosshairs will reappear. Uh, if you note, there's multiple crosshairs, and a lot of times, because of the way the astronauts took photos, they had the camera was mounted to their chest, and they essentially pointed it where they were going. So a lot of the photos they took weren't aesthetically pleasing, and they tended to be cropped down to meet some, basically center things more properly in the picture. So that results in crosshairs being scattered all over the place and not being off center at all. In fact, you can see a lot of the off center crosshaired photos. You can find their parent photos and see that there's multiple crosshairs in the photo, and that it was just basically recentered so it would be aesthetically pleasing to us. This one's always a lot of fun. There's no stars in any of the photos. So I'm going to try to give you an example, see if this helps you out if you're having trouble with this one. And I'll give you some practical examples as well. So imagine you're in the backyard and you're listening to birds, and then somebody blows an air horn. Now let's imagine for a moment that the birds uh, don't fly away, they're not frightened, they continue singing. You're not going to be able to hear the birds. You're only going to be able to hear the air horn. Essentially, what we're illustrating here is it's possible for two things to be there, but one of them to be completely undetectable because the other one overwhelms it. Now, let's put that in context in a moment. Even if we walk around the house trying to get closer to the birds, as long as that air horn's there, we're still only going to hear the air horn. Now, let's just pay attention only to the air horn in the example. Okay, so you're at the back of the house. The air horn's on the other side of the house, but you can still hear it and it's drowning out the birds. If you climbed a ladder, the sound would get louder and louder until it reached maximum until you got to the top of the house. When you come back down, you still hear the air horn, but you don't have a direct line of sight to it. How is it it works like that? How is it sound is getting to your ears even though you have an object directly in front of you blocking it? Uh, Essentially, you get the same effect. So we'll now put these into context. Stars are actually in the Earth's daytime sky. Uh, that's similar to what I'm trying to describe with the idea of the birds and the air horn. The birds are the stars, the air horn is the sun. The sun is just so incredibly powerful that it completely overpowers the stars. Now, there are times during the year, handful of times, where Venus is actually visible in the late afternoon with the sun up. It's very hard to find. You have to know exactly where to look. And then also, as illustrated in the picture here, and I just saw this a few years ago with the last full solar eclipse, when the sun goes completely behind the moon, the stars come out. So they're always there. It's just the sun doesn't let us see it. The sun not only isn't any weaker when it's shining on the moon, it's actually in many ways stronger. So imagine also, let's say you were in an outdoor stadium at night. Okay, with all the lights on, it's almost impossible to see the stars. You might be able to see the moon, might catch a few planets, but most of the stars will be washed out. As soon as you turn the lights out, the stars come back. Now, one of the things that also confuses people is what you're actually seeing on the moon. So on Earth, the sky is blue. And essentially what's happening is the shortest waves are absorbed and scattered by gas, primarily nitrogen, and this scattering gives the atmosphere a blue hue. The moon has no atmosphere, so the moon's sky is black because there's no or only vestigial gases present. So when you look at the moon and it's black, it's not because it's nighttime, it's because it lacks the atmosphere to give it any kind of color. So therefore you can have the sun shining, a black sky, and still no stars visible. The primary effect of an atmosphere versus no atmosphere is that all objects emit light, will be boosted by the same factor on the moon. Some blue objects would look a little bit more blue on the moon. So just like Earth, getting into the shade or having a low sun angle won't make the stars appear. So like the example where I was saying is you could have the house on one side of you and the air horns on the other. You can still hear the air horn even though the house is in the way, and it doesn't make the birds any easier to hear. So if you have a geological outcropping, the shadow of a landing craft or whatever behind you, it's still not going to make the stars appear. Same way, the light comes around even though you have a shadow spot around you. Uh, so, okay, sorry about that. Apollo 16 actually captured an image of Venus from the surface with no enhancements. A little harder to see in this photo, but if you find the blow up of it, it's definitely something's there. And if it wasn't Venus, I think most people on Earth, or at least people with a little bit of astronomical background, could have confirmed whether Venus would have been visible from there or not at that time. Apollo 16 also ran an ultraviolet camera and was able to photograph the stars, and the positions were consistent with being on the moon. So, how is it that this can be done in full daylight? Cameras and eyes end up dealing with light levels in a similar way. Bright light requires lowering the number of photons reaching the sensor in order to resolve the scene. At the point, objects emitting less photons per centimeter get lost in the noise, kind of like birds in the air horn. To give the principle, the sun puts out 10 to the 24th photons per square inch. A similar sun 100 light years away would put out 10,000 photons per square inch. So essentially, the competition of photons, the sun's going to generally overwhelm uh, anything definitely outside the solar system. The shadows run the wrong way in pictures, proof of multiple light sources. Okay, can you explain this one on the surface of the Earth? You can see that there's some similarities to things that are happening in some of those lunar photographs. We have the shadow of the photographer running straight, but if you look at the poles running along, they seem to be pointing at slightly different angles. And this is just a trick of how the sun comes about. Uh, this is a legitimate photograph. No one altered it. And I don't think anyone's suggesting that there were faked multiple light sources on the surface of the Earth. Uh, some people bring up the fact that a spotlight effect appears in many pictures. This is something known as Heiligenschein, an optical phenomenon in which a bright spot appears around the shadow of a viewer's head in the presence of dew. Pits in the moon and the nature of moon dust causes a similar effect. And a lot of times, if you look at these supposed hotspot pictures, ones that people are trying to prove the moon landing is a hoax, a lot of them run enhancement filters to actually make them look brighter than they actually are. If you go back to the parent photo, it's not nearly as prominent. The flag is fluttering in the breeze. Okay, well, the flag is fixed to an aluminum frame that allows it to stand rigid. The video in the video that most people are talking about, the flag rocks back and forth due to the astronaut's last interaction with it. An object in motion stays in motion. The photo seems to show a rippling flag, but the flag was packed and it was unpacked wrinkled. And aesthetically, they decided later that that looked actually pretty good, so they decided to leave it that way. Now, if what the people purporting it to be a moon hoax are right, let's say that is a breeze blowing the flag around. Why isn't any of the dust moving then? Footprints in the moon dust are unexpectedly well preserved despite a lack of moisture. Well, moon dust hasn't been weathered like Earth sand and has sharp edges. This allows the dust particles to stick together and hold their shape in the vacuum. The astronauts likened it to talcum powder or wet sand. Some people try to claim that during Apollo 15, a experiment was run where a falcon feather and a hammer are dropped and they land simultaneously. Some people try to claim that that wouldn't work that way, but essentially it proves at the very least they're in a vacuum. Some people bring up the idea that the air conditioning units that were part of the astronaut spacesuits could not have worked in an environment with no atmosphere. The cooling units that were the way they were designed could only work in a vacuum, not at all like our standard AC units. Water from a tank in the backpack flowed out through tiny pores in the metal in the sublimator plate, which made it quickly vaporize into space. The loss of the heat via the vaporization froze the remaining water, forming a layer of ice on the outside of the plate that also sublimated into space, going from a solid directly to a gas. A separate water loop flowed from the liquid cooling garment worn by the astronaut, carrying his metabolic waste heat through the sublimator plate, where it was then cooled and returned to the LCG. 12 pounds of feed water gave them about 8 hours worth of cooling. Because of its bulk, it was often the limiting consumable for the length of an EVA. Some people will point out that the NASA computers of the time had or 96 kilobyte computers. It'd be impossible for tech like that to be used for navigation. Well, we were doing complicated navigation well before there were computers. During World War I, German artillerists fired guns at targets over 6 miles distant. These targets were over hills and not observable. The Germans calculated how to hit their targets by backing out the map coordinates. They then had to adjust for wind speed, and then they had to adjust for changes in air resistance uh, into changing altitudes, going up and going down. And then they had to deal with the Coriolis effect. And if you don't know what that is, Coriolis effect is the spin of the Earth. If you don't account for it, you lose over enough distance. You miss your target. This is stuff that the Germans were pretty much doing with slide rules and pieces of paper, and they were doing it very fast on the fly. If they were able to do something like that in the early 1900s, the idea that we couldn't do the same thing with a small computer that's dedicated to the task uh, isn't doesn't float very well. In addition, the computers weren't the only thing they used for navigation. You may remember this from the movie Apollo 13, where they would occasionally do 3-point correlation to known astronomical objects in the sky to basically get their proper bearing. And if it was off, they basically tweak the computer with these views. Radio and telemetry could be used to determine distance via the Doppler effect, which is also one of the reasons it made it hard for uh, them to potentially fake all this, because people on the ground could basically watch what was going on with that. Uh, some people point out that one of the moon rocks in a Dutch museum turned out to be fake. It was actually Arizona petrified wood. The 89-gram sample was not on the proper display board. The sample should have been a gram. The curator who accepted the sample was very old, nearly deaf and blind. Turns out there were other Dutch samples at that museum that were real. Some people mention that Werner von Braun was sent to Antarctica to collect moon meteorites. He did actually go to Antarctica, but as far as we know, no moon meteorites were discovered down there. The first known moon meteorite was found in 1979, identified in 1982. A total of 30 kilograms total meteorites have been discovered on Earth from the moon. Apollo brought back 380 kilograms. Unmanned missions to the moon brought back rocks as well, including a Soviet sampler mission. They brought back 626 grams of moon material. Uh, the moon material that the Soviets brought back show a lack of hydrous alteration products. They show evidence of having undergone impact events in an airless body. They have unique geochemical traits, and furthermore, most are more than 200 million years older than the oldest Earth rocks. The moon rocks that Apollo brought back closely match what basically the Soviet rocks and the NASA rocks basically match. Another one of the favorite items that people bring up, that the cameras were somehow unworkable in the spacesuits. The camera was actually attached to the suit. The trigger was in the handle. It was a specially made camera. It had very limited settings and manipulators because they already kind of knew what the lighting levels were going to be, so that astronauts didn't have to do that much to them to basically get them to take a good picture. And there's a lot of bad pictures, and there's a lot of pictures that are off center. It was a point and shoot with a sight rather than a viewfinder, and that's why you see so many cropping issues with these moon photos. The astronauts had extensive training with the cameras. They took them home, practiced with them, and the film was developed so they could critique how they were doing. People will claim cameras can't function on the moon. Heat, no air, no ambient heat. The only heat there is from absorption. And if you look, the cameras are actually coated white, so reflective material fixes that problem. The radiation issue we discussed previously. If the astronauts can survive, then the film can too. The film canisters were specifically developed to protect against radiation. All landings were performed at dawn or dusk. And then the last thing we'll get into for this video, space is filled with super fast micrometeors that would punch through the ship and kill the astronauts. Well, space is really amazingly big. While there are indeed an uncountable number of tiny pieces of debris traveling through the solar system at speeds in the neighborhood of 120,000 miles per hour, the volume of space keeps the density low. The chance of any given cubic yard of space having a micrometeor passing through it is incredibly close to zero. Additionally, the astronaut suits were made with layers including Kevlar to prevent them or protect them from any tiny fragment that they might encounter. And even if you do get a hit, not all hits are instant punctures. A weak micrometeor might disintegrate and pit the object hit. Depending on the shape of the projectile, it might bounce off. It could impact force without ever penetrating. So, or comment below. Did you, if you heard some of these claims before, what do you think about them? Do you think some of them are still legit despite the explanations that are being given? Tell me what you think below. Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithm brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, take a look at my other titles out there and consider subscribing. I cover a very large swath of different ideas for topics. And if you know somebody who might find this useful, please consider sharing it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.